Imagine standing in your brand new silk wedding dress and realizing that by the end of the night, every penny you own, every decision about your body, and even your right to see your children will legally belong to someone else. Not a metaphor, not a possibility, a fact. Ask Frances Power Cobb. She inherited a small fortune in the morning and watched her husband claim it before sunset. Or picture the aristocratic proof tradition. Blood-stained sheets held up for public inspection, as if your private body were a public exhibit. And if you disagreed with your husband, he could have you committed to an asylum for the crime of being difficult. Victorian romance was not candlelight and roses. It was a legal trap with better wallpaper. If this history feels uncomfortably close to the present in some ways, you should subscribe, or you're basically helping these stories vanish again. Your choice. By the way, what time is it where you are? I like knowing exactly how far past bedtime you've gone for this. You aren't just marrying a man. You're signing away legal personhood. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's the black-letter law of the Victorian era, neatly wrapped in a doctrine with the almost charming name of coverture. It comes from an old Norman French word meaning covering, which sounds cozy, like a blanket, until you realize it's the legal equivalent of being buried alive in paperwork. Under coverture, the moment you said "I do," you ceased to exist as a separate legal being. Not reduced, not limited, extinguished. The law quite cheerfully declared that husband and wife were one person, and that person was the husband. Your identity, property, earnings, and even your body were legally absorbed into his. Before marriage, you could own property, sign contracts, sue or be sued, make a will, even decide who inherited your grandmother's teacup collection. After marriage, all gone. You couldn't buy a loaf of bread on credit without your husband's approval. Technically, you couldn't even refuse medical treatment he authorized. And if he wanted to read your letters, follow your movements, or decide whether you saw your own family, the law was on his side. Caroline Norton learned this the hard way. A well-connected writer who married a member of Parliament in 1827, she found herself beaten, locked out of her home, and separated from her 3 young sons, legally powerless to stop it. Her husband, George, didn't just keep the children, he prevented her from even seeing them. She would write, "I am a prisoner here, and my children are my prison wardens." That wasn't melodrama. That was an accurate legal summary. Under coverture, children belonged to their father outright. The mother had no legal relationship to them at all. Now, if you're imagining this as the exception, some rare horror story, you'll be disappointed. Or impressed, depending on your tolerance for legal cruelty. The system worked exactly as designed, and that design was about more than controlling women. It was about controlling property. In the Victorian marriage market, love was nice, but it was also negotiable. Dowries, settlements, and family alliances were the real glue holding marriages together. The union wasn't just between 2 people, it was between 2 balance sheets. Here's how it worked. Your family, especially your father or guardian, would negotiate your marriage settlement with your future husband's family. These weren't candlelit conversations over brandy. They were formal legal documents, drawn up by solicitors, listing exactly what property or cash you brought into the marriage, and what income it would produce. It was essentially a business merger, with you as one of the assets. And the husband? He got full control over all of it. Even if the settlement specified that the money was for your maintenance, he decided what that meant. Maybe it meant a decent dress allowance. Maybe it meant you could have coal for the fire in winter. maybe it meant he'd gamble it away and you'd make do with cold tea. The law didn't care. The money was his to manage. For aristocratic women, the sums could be enormous. Entire estates, stocks, jewelry collections. For middle-class women, it might be a modest inheritance or a small dowry. For working-class brides, it could be whatever household goods they owned. A bedstead, a kettle, perhaps a chest of drawers. All of it transferred to the husband's ownership. The idea was that men were the natural stewards of property, the protectors of family assets. This was less about actual protection and more about making sure property stayed within male control. Even the rare separate estate arrangements, where a woman's property was technically hers, required elaborate trusts and the cooperation of her male relatives. A safeguard the wealthy sometimes used, but ordinary women couldn't afford. Dowries themselves weren't just a quaint tradition, they were a form of prepayment. Your family effectively bought your financial security in the marriage, or at least they hoped to. If your husband mismanaged that money, there was no refund. Settlements also controlled what happened if your husband died. You might receive a jointure, an income for life, but the exact amount was fixed at the wedding, often without your input. If the settlement was stingy, you could find yourself a widow with the same legal resources as a washerwoman, except the washerwoman might actually have more control over her earnings. And romance? That was the optional extra. Marriages were negotiated as carefully as trade agreements. Wealth, status, family connections, even political alliances factored into the decision. A love match was possible, but it was a happy coincidence, not the plan. Charles Darwin famously made a pros and cons list before proposing to his cousin Emma Wedgwood. Under cons, he listed loss of time, less money for books, and terrible loss of freedom. Under pros, he included constant companion and someone to take care of the house. He decided in favor of marriage, but not without weighing it like a business decision. In the eyes of Victorian society, this was not cynical. It was responsible. Marriage was an economic partnership with the man as CEO and the woman as, well, technically she wasn't even on the payroll. And here's where the sarcasm writes itself. Nothing says eternal love quite like a signed financial instrument between your father and a man you met twice. Imagine walking down the aisle knowing that somewhere, in a solicitor's office, there's a document that describes your future as maintenance obligations and property transfers. From the outside, the Victorian wedding looked like a triumph of romance. White silk, lace veils, floral arches. But underneath the confetti was a binding legal contract that for women was closer to a corporate takeover. So as you stand there in your gown, listening to the vicar pronounce you husband and wife, understand what those words mean in this century. You are no longer a legal entity. Your property, your body, and, should you have them, your children now belong to the man beside you. And you agreed to it in front of witnesses, who will all go home and call it the happiest day of your life. The day is yours. At least, that's what everyone keeps saying. From the moment you opened your eyes this morning, you've been told it's your day. But the reality is that this day has been choreographed for everyone else's benefit. The relatives who need to be impressed, the neighbors who need something to gossip about, and the family friends who came purely to compare your flowers to someone else's. You're dressed in layers of silk and lace, the kind that don't bend when you sit and don't breathe when you stand. The veil is long enough to trip a footman and heavy enough to pull on your neck. You've been congratulated so many times you've stopped answering. You've smiled for formal photographs that require you to stand perfectly still for far longer than any living person should. Every handshake is a subtle reminder of the new alliance you've just entered into, not just with your husband, but with his family, their friends, and the social orbit they occupy. You are a newly acquired member of a clan, and they are inspecting you the way one might inspect a new thoroughbred horse. Polite admiration, with a mental list of what they expect you to produce. The ceremony has passed, a blur of organ music, murmured vows, and the moment you realize that from now on, your signature will never be quite your own. The legal weight of what you've agreed to hasn't settled in yet because you're being kept moving. The reception is in full swing. The room smells of wax, flowers, and an undertone of roast meat from the dining hall. Glasses clink. People are already speculating about the future heirs, loudly in earshot, as if your womb were public property now that you've signed the register. You catch fragments of conversation. Strong stock on her side. He'll want a son, of course, but let's hope she's not too delicate. They'll have a houseful before long. You are expected to laugh lightly at these comments, as if strangers discussing your reproductive timeline were charming. If you're middle or upper class, there will be a dinner, complete with formal toasts. Your husband's friends will clap him on the back, make jokes about his luck in securing you, and, depending on their level of subtlety, make hints about the night ahead. The women will smile at you with that knowing, pitying expression older wives reserve for brides. Equal parts, you poor thing, and better you than me. If you're working class, the celebration may be more modest, perhaps a gathering at a local pub or in the home of a relative. But the dynamic is the same. Endless congratulations, too much food, and the looming awareness that everyone knows exactly what's supposed to happen once you leave. Privacy may be a luxury you don't have. In a shared household, your wedding night could take place with other family members just a thin wall away. Sometimes, in cramped lodgings, there's no wall at all. Back at the reception, you find yourself surrounded by the people who have been your chaperones for months. Your mother, your aunt, a family friend who once accidentally walked into the conservatory while you were talking to your fiancé. They have monitored every glance and word between you and your husband-to-be, and now, suddenly, after the vows, they disappear. There is a strange ceremony to this vanishing act. The moment you are legally bound, the protective wall of supervision drops away. A man who, yesterday, could not hold your hand without risking scandal is now entitled to your full physical compliance, and no one will intervene. It's as if a silent switch has been flipped. You are no longer someone to be protected from impropriety. You are someone who is expected to fulfill it. For middle and upper class couples, there may be a formal departure. You and your husband climbing into a carriage, the crowd waving, rice or flower petals tossed into the air. People call out well wishes as if sending you on a pleasant holiday, not into a legal arrangement where the rules have just changed entirely. The carriage ride itself is a performance. You are on display until you turn the final corner and are out of sight. If you're wealthier, you might travel to your husband's home or to a hired hotel suite for the first night. The space will have been prepared in advance. Bed turned down, fire lit, perhaps flowers or candles placed in artful arrangements, by servants who are fully aware of the occasion. In some households, these same servants are expected to discreetly note the success of the night, reporting to the family in a quiet but unmistakable code. For working-class couples, the journey is shorter and the audience smaller, but the awareness of what's next is no less intense. You might walk home together from the celebration or retire to a small rented room. The space may be far from private, shared yards, thin walls, or family members in adjoining beds. Either way, you feel the day narrowing toward its inevitable conclusion. The endless public attention of the wedding day, the clinking glasses, the smiles, the chatter, all funnel toward the moment the door closes and you are alone together for the first time. The irony is that after months or years of being supervised, chaperoned, and lectured about propriety, no one has actually told you what happens next. You are expected to know, to be ready, and to comply, as if this knowledge were somehow magically transferred the moment you became a wife. The carriage jolts over a rut in the road. You realize you've been staring out the window without seeing anything. Your husband is beside you, silent or making small talk, perhaps awkward, perhaps overly confident. Outside, the last of the day's light fades. The streets are quieter now, the celebration behind you. You're heading toward a room you've never slept in a house that is yours in name only, to spend the night with a man who, until today, could not kiss you without it being a scandal. The chaperones are gone. The toasts are done. The eyes of the guests no longer on you. But the awareness that you are still being measured, in different ways, by different standards, has never been stronger. And if you think this parts of history are worth remembering, then subscribe. Otherwise, they'll keep disappearing, just like the women who lived them. The door closes. The last murmur of conversation from the hallway fades. And suddenly, after an entire day of noise and congratulations, you're in a room so quiet you can hear the faint tick of the mantel clock. This is the first time all day, maybe in your entire courtship, that you've been alone with him. Not chaperoned, not in public, not watched by an aunt in the corner pretending to embroider. Just the two of you, and the pressure of centuries of expectation. What you know about what happens next depends entirely on your luck in birth and upbringing, which in Victorian England is to say probably not much. Most brides entered marriage armed with nothing more than a handful of euphemisms, a few vague metaphors, and an inherited sense of duty that boiled down to one instruction: endure. If your mother spoke to you at all on the subject, it was probably in the language of virtue. A wife must be patient. You mustn't be afraid. Or, it will be over quickly. Comforting, in the same way someone saying the dentist will be done in a minute, is comforting, right before they take out the drill. The more genteel the family, the less direct the information. If you're upper class, your education might have come from a leather-bound manual written by a retired clergyman, full of botanical analogies. Entire chapters comparing marriage to the pollination of flowers or the way a vine clings to the oak. Poetic, yes. Informative, no. Some guides simply avoided the subject altogether, focusing instead on table manners, moral conduct, and the correct way to address a duke. Mrs. Beaton could tell you how to host a 12-course dinner, but nothing about what to expect in the marriage bed. The knowledge gap wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. Ignorance was seen as a mark of purity, a kind of bridal asset to be preserved until the wedding night. And then there were the helpful family stories, cautionary tales whispered by older female relatives in hallways or over teacups. A cousin who took ill after her wedding night and was never the same. A sister-in-law who did her duty and was rewarded with a string of pregnancies that nearly killed her. These weren't meant to frighten you, but they did. They also did nothing to explain the mechanics of what was coming. Queen Victoria herself, raised in an environment of careful supervision and minimal frankness, was shocked by her own wedding night. Her journals hint at the overwhelming physical and emotional impact. The strange mix of anticipation, fear, and sheer unpreparedness that countless other women, less powerful than she, would have to navigate without even the luxury of writing it down. And now it's your turn. You sit in a room that smells faintly of beeswax polish and the ghost of flowers from the reception. The fire is low, the bed impossibly large, with a canopy that turns it into a kind of stage. A maid has been in earlier to arrange the sheets, and perhaps to note silently that she will be the one to collect them tomorrow. The thought makes your skin prickle. Your husband may be as inexperienced as you are. Many young men had only the vaguest understanding, gleaned from locker room boasts, dangerous brothel visits, or equally unhelpful books written by doctors who thought women didn't have sexual feelings at all. Or he may be vastly more experienced, in which case he has very definite expectations about tonight, and the law to back them up. There's a quiet to this moment that feels heavier than silence. It's not peaceful. It's a pause before something you can't quite picture, but can't avoid. The day has been full of people telling you you're beautiful, you're lucky, you're beginning the happiest chapter of your life. None of those people are here now. None of them will be here if it goes badly. You catch sight of yourself in the dressing mirror, hair loosened, veil removed, cheeks still flushed from champagne and nerves. You look like someone who should know what's next, but you don't, and there's no one left to ask. This is the storm you've been led toward all day, and the great irony is that it's happening in utter stillness. The house sleeps, the world outside is dark, and you sit here in the fine nightgown someone chose for you, waiting for a door to open again. The trouble with this room isn't just the bed. It's the invisible law standing in the corner, not a person, not a witness, but as present as if you could hear it breathing. That law says your husband has the right to you, not in the abstract, not in some romanticized two become one poetry. No, in the legal sense, as in you cannot say no. It's called the marital duty, or if you read the right legal commentary from the period, a sacred right of the husband. And right here doesn't mean an emotional expectation, it means an enforceable reality. Your consent was legally assumed the moment you married, and the law never let you take it back. Dr. William Acton, a Victorian authority on sexual health, or at least on what Victorians believed was sexual health, wrote in 1857 that the husband has the right to enforce sexual intercourse, as this is the wife's duty and his natural right. Note the language. Enforce. Not request. Not hope for. Enforce. The courts agreed. The legal reasoning was simple. Husband and wife were one person under the law, and the husband was that person. A wife's refusal was therefore a refusal of herself, which the law decided was impossible. And if she did persist in refusing, well, there were ways to deal with that. In public perception, a woman who resisted her husband was not defending her autonomy. She was breaking the marriage contract. Worse, she was showing signs of mental instability. The diagnosis could be anything from hysteria to nymphomania. Yes, refusing sex could be labeled nymphomania in the twisted Victorian medical lexicon, But the conclusion was the same. Something was wrong with her mind. You didn't just risk your husband's anger. You risked your reputation, your safety, and in some cases, your freedom. Because once a husband and a compliant doctor agreed you were unwell, you could be committed to an asylum. Indefinitely. Consider Lady Colin Campbell, whose name became shorthand for scandal in 1886. Married to a man of high status and low morals, she contracted syphilis from his affairs. Even in illness, she was expected to do her duty. When she begged him to take precautions to prevent further infection, he refused, calling it an insult to his manhood. He forced himself on her repeatedly, and when she finally sought a legal separation, the courtroom spectacle made her the villain. The idea that a wife could legitimately refuse her husband was so alien, it was treated as a form of treason against the institution of marriage. And here is where the sarcasm writes itself. Ah yes, nothing says mutual affection like the threat of being declared insane for wanting privacy. You, sitting in that room, are not thinking of law books or parliamentary debates. But the weight of all that precedent is there, pressing down. If your husband wants you tonight, the law is on his side. If you don't want him, the law is still on his side. If you push back too hard, he has a society ready to call you sick, unnatural, or dangerous, and a medical profession prepared to agree. Dr. Acton himself claimed that healthy women had little to no sexual feeling, and that wives who enjoyed intercourse were pathological. Yes, in Victorian Britain, you could be condemned both for not wanting sex and for wanting it too much. It was a kind of double bind that left no space for you to exist on your own terms. Even the idea of mutual comfort in marriage was warped through this lens. Moralists wrote about the husband's duty to instruct his wife in the marriage bed, which sounds like guidance, but in practice meant overriding any reluctance she might have. The act itself was framed not as shared intimacy, but as proof of her obedience, and it wasn't confined to private life. The social circles you moved in would take note of a wife who seemed cold toward her husband. Servants gossiped. Friends speculated. Family members hinted that you should try harder to please him. The risk wasn't just what happened behind closed doors. It was the chain reaction of judgment that could follow if the marriage was perceived as anything less than physically harmonious. Of course, none of this was spelled out to you beforehand. When the vows were read in church, no one leaned in to whisper, "By the way, this means your right to refuse has expired." It was simply understood. Part of the fine print no one bothered to print. So you sit in that bridal chamber, in the hush between the clinking glasses of the reception and the turn of the doorknob, knowing that the expectations of your husband, your family, your society, and your legal system are perfectly aligned, and you are on the other side of that alignment. In wealthier homes, this was overlaid with ceremony. The bridal chamber might be prepared by maids who laid out your nightdress and fluffed the pillows, the same maids who would be tasked with collecting and inspecting the bedsheets in the morning for evidence of consummation. In working-class homes, the transition was less ceremonious, but just as binding. The day ended, the door closed, and the understanding was that the husband's right would be exercised. The cruelty of this arrangement wasn't always visible to the people living in it, which may be why it lasted so long. Husbands who thought of themselves as honorable still believed in their marital rights. Wives who loved their husbands still understood refusal as a dangerous breach, and the few women who tried to contest it often found that the legal system wasn't just indifferent to their plight, it actively worked against them. By the end of the 19th century, cracks had begun to appear in the facade. Debates over women's rights and custody laws hinted at the possibility that consent might matter inside marriage. But for most of the Victorian era, that possibility remained theoretical. In practice, the wedding ring was a binding contract that transferred ownership. And tonight is the first night you feel the full weight of it. The fire on the hearth has burned low. The scent of roses from the reception flowers has faded into the wool of the carpet. You can hear footsteps in the hall, steady and certain. The door opens. The law in the corner doesn't move, because it doesn't have to. Its work is already done. The morning after the wedding night was not always about sleeping late and sipping tea in bed. In certain circles, it came with a task, and it wasn't making breakfast. It was providing proof. Not proof that you enjoyed yourself, not proof that the two of you even liked each other. No, this was proof of something far more specific, that you, the bride, had arrived at the altar untouched, and that your husband had successfully changed that condition before sunrise. For some aristocratic families, and in certain rural communities clinging to older traditions, this proof took the form of a blood-stained sheet, a tangible, physical artifact of the wedding night, displayed not as a private memento, but as a public statement. The logic was simple, in the way that all bad logic is simple. If the bride had been a virgin, the act of consummation would produce a trace of blood. This evidence would be collected on the bedsheet and come morning, inspected or even displayed as a sign that the marriage had been properly sealed. In aristocratic households, this could be a formal presentation. The sheet might be shown discreetly to older female relatives, or less discreetly to a cluster of waiting servants. In some rural communities, it was even paraded, hung from a window, draped across a line in the courtyard, or pinned to a doorway. In these cases, privacy wasn't just absent, it was unthinkable. Your intimate life was a village announcement, fluttering in the breeze. The pressure was not solely on you. The groom had his own performance metrics. If no evidence appeared, the whispers would begin. Was the bride not pure? Was the groom not up to the task? Perhaps worst of all in a society obsessed with appearances, was there some hidden scandal? The male side of this equation was about virility, proving himself as capable on his wedding night as he was at managing his estates, his accounts, or his public reputation. The female side was about chastity, proving you had arrived unsullied from the care of your father into the possession of your husband. Between the two, the wedding night became less a private moment and more a trial with two defendants, and no right to remain silent. The humiliation of this tradition was not lost on the women who endured it. Imagine your first experience of physical intimacy, whatever it entailed, followed by the knowledge that strangers, possibly the entire household, are waiting to handle the linen afterward, waiting to interpret it, waiting to judge you based on the presence or absence of a stain. And here's where Victorian delicacy about private matters meets its own hypocrisy. These were the same people who avoided discussing sex in direct terms, who couched advice in botanical metaphors and warned brides against asking too many questions. Yet, the moment the marriage was consummated, they were perfectly comfortable turning your body into a piece of forensic evidence for public consumption. It wasn't uniquely British, either. Similar customs existed in parts of France, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire, though the form varied. In some Mediterranean villages, for example, the mother-in-law might be the first to inspect the sheets. In certain Eastern European regions, the tradition became a staged event with music, dancing, and the display of the proof as part of the post-wedding festivities. The scale changed, but the underlying message was the same. A woman's worth on her wedding night was measured in visible signs, and everyone was invited to take a look. Of course, human biology is not as simple as these customs pretended. Not all women bleed the first time, and not all blood is visible. Some women used clever workarounds, pricking a finger, smuggling in drops of animal blood, or arranging for the sheets to be prepared in advance. These weren't just tricks. They were acts of survival in a system that could ruin a woman's standing, and by extension her entire life, over a piece of cloth. The absence of a stain could be catastrophic. For the bride, it could mean being branded as impure or untrustworthy. For the groom, it could mean being mocked for incompetence. Either way, the fallout would spread quickly, especially in smaller communities where gossip moved faster than the post. Even in households where the tradition wasn't physically enacted, the concept lingered as a silent expectation. The idea that the bride's virtue must be proven and that the groom's ability must be demonstrated shaped the way the wedding night was approached. It wasn't simply about closeness, it was about producing a result. And like all high-pressure tests, it made genuine comfort and intimacy nearly impossible. Now, if you're imagining that everyone accepted this quietly, think again. Some brides refused outright, some grooms quietly ignored the custom, and in the privacy of marital bedrooms, many couples decided not to perform for anyone but themselves. But as long as the tradition persisted in the social imagination, it remained a shadow over the wedding night, a reminder that what should have been private was, in reality, public property. You, sitting in your newly assigned bed, are aware of this shadow. You may not know exactly who will see the sheets in the morning or whether they'll be displayed at all, but you know someone will ask. Even if it's just a knowing glance from a servant as they strip the bed, the implication will be there. It's an odd thing to have the most personal threshold of your life treated like an event to be documented and verified. To have the moment that is supposed to bond you and your husband treated as a report card for the entire household. And the worst part? In many places, this wasn't just old-fashioned curiosity. It was a legal safeguard. In disputes over annulments or legitimacy of heirs, that first night's proof could become evidence in court. The fire in your chamber burns low. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimes. In another hour or two, you might be asleep, or pretending to be. But you know that whatever happens in this room tonight, it won't entirely stay here. The Victorian ideal of privacy in marriage had its limits, and those limits stopped at the bedroom door, right before the linen press. If this feels like too much to stomach in one night, imagine living it, and then maybe hit subscribe so I know you're at least listening. You have never met Dr. William Acton. You've never written to him, never asked his opinion, never even seen his face in a sketch. And yet, somehow, he already has quite a lot to say about you. Or at least, about your natural disposition as a woman. He is certain, for instance, that you have no real interest in sex. Not you personally, but you as a category. Respectable women in general. Any spark of physical desire, he writes confidently, belongs to the coarser type of female, prostitutes, fallen women, or those with an unfortunate excess of animal energy. For a respectable wife, marital intimacy is a duty, not a pleasure. And if you find yourself disagreeing, well, That's simply more proof you're not respectable at all. This is the foundation of much Victorian medical thought, that women were naturally passive, naturally disinclined, and naturally designed to endure rather than enjoy. It was a convenient belief. It allowed men, and by extension husbands, to dismiss any protest as irrelevant. If you didn't want intimacy, it was because you were normal. If you did want it, it was because you were abnormal. Either way, your own wishes were removed from the equation entirely. And then, in a twist that only the 19th century could produce, this natural passivity was used to justify forcing you into intimacy you didn't want. Many doctors, men naturally, argued that regular sexual relations were healthful for a wife, even if she objected. Marital rape, though not called by that name, was reframed as therapy. A reluctant bride could be cured of her nervousness, hysteria, or low spirits by persistent conjugal attention from her husband. It sounds grotesque because it was grotesque. But at the time, it wore a respectable face. Learned men in frock coats and side whiskers wrote essays for medical journals, assuring one another that they were protecting women's health. If a wife resisted, it wasn't because she was being violated. It was because she was suffering from frigidity, a condition to be treated, often with more of the very thing she dreaded. The pseudoscience didn't stop there. Some physicians actively promoted the idea that women's pleasure was dangerous. Too much stimulation, they warned, could cause nervous exhaustion, moral corruption, or even madness. The female orgasm, when acknowledged at all, was considered either unnecessary or outright harmful. And so certain doctors, again entirely uninvited, suggested preventive measures. In extreme cases, this meant surgical intervention, clitoridectomy, the removal of the clitoris, performed under the banner of treating masturbation, hysteria, or excessive desire. While never as widespread in Britain as in some medical circles abroad, the fact that such procedures were even contemplated and occasionally carried out reveals just how determined the era was to control women's bodies, not only in the marriage bed, but in every private thought. Now picture yourself as a Victorian bride, absorbing this worldview without even realizing it. You've been taught since girlhood that good women are modest, uncurious, and physically delicate. You've been told that the less you know about your own anatomy, the better. And yet, here you are on your wedding night, with a husband who may have read or heard repeated these medical opinions, and who now believes that your reluctance is a temporary illness to be cured by his persistence. The result is an odd reversal. Your doctor, your husband, and perhaps even your mother-in-law all believe they understand your needs better than you do. And if those needs happen to align with their own priorities, well, all the better. The rest cure provides another example of how medicine and marriage could join forces in ways you'd rather they didn't. Originally developed as a treatment for nervous disorders in women, the rest cure involved weeks or months of enforced bed rest, isolation from stimulating conversation, and a diet heavy on milk and bland foods. Exercise was forbidden. Writing or reading was discouraged. The stated goal was to calm the nerves. The unstated result was to strip a woman of her independence and keep her firmly under someone else's control. In a marriage, the rest cure could function as a kind of punishment. A wife who was too argumentative, too melancholic, or too unwilling in the bedroom might be prescribed a period of rest by her husband, often on the advice of a conveniently sympathetic doctor. This meant confinement, surveillance, and the constant implication that her dissatisfaction was a medical flaw, not a reaction to her circumstances. And through it all, the language of health provided a respectable cover. Your comfort was secondary, your consent irrelevant. What mattered was that the men in authority could point to a body of professional opinion and declare, with perfect seriousness, that this was for your own good. You might never see the doctor who decided these things. He might live 3 towns away, treating patients you've never met. He might base his opinions on theories passed along from colleagues who themselves relied on even older, shakier ideas. But because he carries the title of doctor, his pronouncements carry weight. Your husband can quote them at you. Your family can repeat them. And you are left with the peculiar sensation of being managed by a man you have never spoken to, a man whose mental picture of you is drawn entirely from prejudice, hearsay, and the occasional lurid anecdote. In this way, medicine became a third party in many Victorian marriages, a silent partner whose role was to define the limits of what was acceptable, desirable, or even permissible. And unlike your own voice, his was always heard. The candle on the bedside table burns lower. You think about how much of your married life will be shaped by conversations you're not part of, diagnoses you never agreed to, and cures that have nothing to do with healing. Somewhere, perhaps right now, a group of doctors are discussing women's nature in a warm, wood-paneled room, nodding along to one another's pronouncements. And without knowing your name, without ever having looked you in the eye, they are deciding how your marriage will work. It's an odd feeling, isn't it? Realizing that the most intimate corners of your life are being mapped out by men in stiff collars who have never stepped into them. You wake up one morning and realize, though no one will phrase it quite this way, that your marriage has been designed to make motherhood less a choice and more a foregone conclusion. It's not simply that you and your husband are expected to have children. It's that there is no lawful, respectable, or even remotely reliable way to avoid it. Contraception in Victorian Britain exists largely in whispers and euphemisms. French letters that are difficult to find and carry social shame if discovered. Sponges and pessaries sold in chemist shops under the counter. Withdrawal, which depends entirely on a level of cooperation your husband may not be inclined to offer. And then there's the legal backdrop. You have no right to refuse your husband without risking your entire standing in the marriage. The law and prevailing medical opinion still grants him conjugal rights, which means, in practical terms, that if he decides tonight is the night, then tonight is the night. And so the cycle begins. Pregnancy follows pregnancy with dizzying regularity for many women. The well-to-do might have slightly longer intervals, time to recover, to hire another nursemaid, but in working-class families, children often arrive in such quick succession that you find yourself caring for a newborn while still nursing a toddler, while also preparing for the next. You don't need a physician to tell you the toll this takes. You can feel it in your bones, in your back, in the way exhaustion seems to settle into your very posture. And there's danger in every birth. Victorian maternal mortality rates are sobering. Infection, hemorrhage, eclampsia. These are words you learn not from books, but from neighbors, cousins, women down the street who were here 1 month and gone the next. In poorer districts, death in childbirth can claim as many as 1 in every 100 women each year. Even among the wealthy, where doctors and private rooms offer better odds, no one considers you safe until you've survived the first month after delivery. But it's not just your life at risk. The law, under the rules of coverture, makes it plain that the children you bear are not legally yours. They belong to your husband, his custody, his decisions, his right to determine their future. If your marriage ends, either by separation or divorce, a near impossible prospect for you, given the legal hurdles, he can take them from you entirely. And some men do. Not simply to punish their wives, though that is motive enough, but because children are assets. In service, in labor, even in the casual cruelty of making a point. The newspapers carry cases of fathers sending sons to work in factories at shockingly young ages, daughters into domestic service miles away, purely to keep them beyond the reach of their mothers. You imagine it. The sudden silence of a home where the children's voices have been removed. The absence is not just physical. It's a deliberate statement, a message delivered through the lives of the people you love most. And in the hierarchy of Victorian priorities, this is considered an acceptable exercise of paternal authority. In this light, motherhood becomes not only a duty, but a tether. The more children you have, the harder it is to leave, financially, socially, legally. Even if you were to endure the scandal and expense of pursuing separation, you would do so knowing that the law leans heavily toward awarding custody to the father, which is, of course, rather convenient for a society that dislikes the idea of women leaving their husbands. After all, if your own children can be used as leverage, you are far more likely to stay. And if the threat of losing them is not enough, the reality of having nowhere to go, no income, no independent legal standing, completes the trap. For some, this life is softened by affection. A husband who is kind, who shares your grief when a child is lost to illness, who tempers his rights with respect. Such men exist. But the legal structure doesn't rely on kindness. It relies on power. And once you understand how that power operates, you can see that motherhood, in the Victorian marriage, is as much about control as it is about family. There is no maternity leave, no postnatal care as we think of it today. The wealthy might confine themselves for weeks after birth, attended by servants, while the poor return to work within days, baby in tow. In both cases, your role as mother is treated as inevitable, your capacity to survive it as assumed. And so the cycle continues. Pregnancy, birth, recovery, if you're lucky, and then another pregnancy, until your body begins to fail, or you reach an age when nature, rather than law, grants you reprieve. By then, you may have a household full of children, or you may have buried several along the way, each loss another unspoken grief. The truth is, motherhood in Victorian Britain was not merely a stage of life. For many, it was the whole of life, unchosen, unending, and bound by laws designed to make it inescapable. Because what's one more way to keep you from leaving? You'd think, after the vows, the reception, and the marathon of polite handshakes, that the evening might finally be yours. It isn't. Before you ever reach this day, there were the flowers, not just the bouquet you'll carry down the aisle, but the coded floral exchanges leading up to it. In Victorian courtship, flowers speak louder than words. An orange blossom signals chastity. Red roses whisper passion. Myrtle promises love in marriage. And heaven help you if you receive yellow carnations. They mean rejection. Every posy is a tiny perfumed telegram, a language you're expected to know without ever having been officially taught. You may think you're just holding a bouquet. In truth, you're clutching a tightly bound bundle of messages about your virtue, your desirability, and your future. Then, there are the charms and tokens, the little talismans passed along by knowing aunties or sly friends. Some are meant to aid consummation, though no one ever defines the term in front of you. It might be a sprig of rosemary tucked into your bouquet for fertility, a silver coin in your shoe for prosperity, a ribbon tied a certain way around your thigh, though you are left to guess why. Some brides are handed tiny sachets of herbs for luck, which, depending on who gave them to you, might be a genuine blessing or a barely veiled hint that you'll need help to get through the night. And then we arrive at etiquette, that invisible rule book dictating even how you are supposed to undress. Modesty, the Victorians assure you, must be maintained even in bed. Some brides slip into nightclothes in an adjoining room before joining their husbands, so there is never a moment of actual disrobing in his sight. Others undress in darkness, speaking in low voices, ensuring that the act remains more symbolic than visual. You may, in fact, spend the first hour of your marriage negotiating whether removing a hairpin counts as immodest. Meanwhile, there is the matter of the bed itself. The wedding chamber, if you're of a certain social standing, is not just any bedroom. It is a stage set. The linens have been turned down. The fire glows just enough to give a flattering warmth without risking a sweaty awkwardness. There are flowers, always flowers, whose scent hovers somewhere between romantic and overwhelming. Candles or gas lights are adjusted to a soft glow, enough to see but not enough to really see. And someone, somewhere, has made these decisions for you. A discreet servant, perhaps the lady's maid who has known you since girlhood, has prepared the room. She will have fluffed the pillows, arranged the counterpane, perhaps even warmed the bed with a brass pan of coals. If you're in a country house or grand estate, there might be several servants involved, the sort who glide in and out like stagehands, never acknowledged in public, but critical to the illusion. You are not supposed to think about them, but you do. After all, they know exactly what this room is for tonight. They will see the sheets in the morning. If you are from a more modest background, the scene might be less theatrical, but no less charged. In a working-class household, you may find yourself in a room still faintly scented with the day's dinner, with a bed that has done double duty as seating for half the guests earlier in the day. Privacy here is not guaranteed. Sometimes it's a single door away from relatives who are still talking and laughing in the next room. Sometimes it's no door at all. Still, the rituals persist. There's the good night from whoever sees you to the room, a moment heavy with implication. In wealthier homes, the household may literally retire in a formal sequence, each person disappearing in turn until the bride and groom are left alone. In humbler settings, you may have to slip away discreetly and hope no one follows with jokes or knowing looks. You notice everything in those moments. The faint creak of the floorboards, the distant murmur of voices downstairs, the smell of wax and flowers, and perhaps a hint of brandy on your new husband's breath. You're hyper-aware of the rustle of your gown as it's unfastened, the way every sound seems amplified in the quiet. You may be thinking of nothing at all, or you may be thinking of everything. The legal contract you've entered, the life that now stretches ahead, the strange choreography of this night that seems designed for an audience you cannot see but can absolutely feel. Because in truth, you are not just two people in a room. You are participants in a public ritual, one that has been enacted in various forms for centuries. Every object in the room, from the carefully folded chemise on the chair to the placement of the lamp, has meaning. Every action, from the removal of a glove to the extinguishing of the final candle, is part of the unspoken performance. And tomorrow, the performance will continue in a different way. The sheets may be inspected. The servants may exchange glances. The guests may look for certain signs in your expression at breakfast. No one will say anything directly, of course. This is Victorian Britain, where silence is its own form of communication. But you will know they know. It's a strange paradox. The wedding night is billed as the most private of occasions, yet it is surrounded by layers of public expectation, superstition, and etiquette so elaborate that you might as well be on a stage. You may not have chosen the script, but you're in it now, and the curtain has just gone up. You might have imagined that your wedding night, no matter your social standing, would involve at least some measure of privacy. That maybe there would be a moment to pause, to exhale, to take in the fact that you are now married. But if you are working class in Victorian Britain, that expectation is best set aside immediately. The truth is, privacy is a luxury. You live where you can afford to live, and for many couples, that means lodging in an already occupied house. Perhaps you rent a single furnished room in a building where the landlady, her husband, their children, and a rotating assortment of other tenants all pass through the same narrow hallway. You might hear someone boiling cabbage in the communal kitchen while you're still untying the ribbons of your bonnet. Somewhere down the corridor, a baby is wailing. Someone's boots clomp on the stairs above you. This is your wedding night soundtrack. If you're lucky enough to have your own room, it is probably not much bigger than the bed itself. There's a washstand tucked into one corner, its basin already cloudy from the evening's earlier use. The air is a mix of damp wool, coal dust, and whatever your neighbors are cooking. Perhaps fried fish if it's Saturday, perhaps reheated mutton if it's not. Silk sheets? No. You have plain cotton, possibly patched, possibly still faintly smelling of the last tenant. And if you were hoping for a romantic lead-up, well, in this setting, the romance is mostly theoretical. The day has been long, and you have been on your feet for much of it. Your wedding dress may be your best Sunday frock, borrowed or sewn from second-hand fabric. The hem is already marked with street dust. You may have walked from the registry office or chapel straight to the nearest public house, where the reception consisted of beer, gin, and maybe a meat pie if someone was feeling generous. Now you're married, and tomorrow you are back to work. There's no honeymoon. Those are for people who can afford to lose a week's wages. If you work as a seamstress, you'll be at your table before noon. If you're in service, you'll be up before the family you work for, clearing breakfast trays as though nothing has changed. And for your husband, he might be back on the docks, or in the foundry, or hauling goods through the city streets. This night is less a grand transition than a brief pause before the familiar grind resumes. Economic dependence plays its part here too. Your livelihood may now hinge on your husband's wages, which gives him the upper hand in more than just household decisions. In some marriages, that dependence is met with mutual care and an unspoken agreement to make the best of things. In others, it opens the door to resentment, control, or worse. And we should be honest. In some lodgings, drunkenness is a common wedding night companion. Alcohol is the cheapest escape from the hardness of daily life, and a day of celebration is the easiest excuse to overindulge. It is not unusual for the groom to arrive at the marriage bed smelling strongly of gin, his mood swinging between boisterous affection and volatile anger. The public house is, after all, where many weddings begin and end. Violence, too, is not unheard of, though it is rarely spoken about outside the walls that contain it. In Victorian working-class culture, certain forms of domestic aggression were disturbingly normalized. A slap or a shove might be dismissed as temper. Neighbors might hear an argument through thin walls and choose not to intervene, telling themselves it's none of their business. The law offers little protection here. The marriage contract binds tightly, and the concept of a wife's consent is, legally speaking, non-existent. This is the reality. For some working-class brides, the wedding night is not a soft unveiling, but another negotiation for safety, another test of endurance in a life already full of them. Still, and it's worth saying, not all is grim. Love, even here, finds its way in. There are couples who share whispered jokes as they step over sleeping children in the next room. Couples who save pennies for weeks to afford a small feast of bread, cheese, and beer in their own space. There are brides who hang a clean cloth over the washstand and set a sprig of flowers in a chipped mug to make the room feel new. You work with what you have, and sometimes what you have is enough to build something real. But the contrast between the working-class wedding night and its upper-class counterpart could not be sharper. There are no discreet servants, no silken coverlets, no carefully staged lighting. Here, intimacy unfolds in the same room where you keep your boots, your tools, your laundry. Sometimes in the same room where you'll eat breakfast tomorrow. Privacy is as thin as the walls, and romance has to fit itself into the cracks between necessity. So, when you finally close the door, if you have one, you do so knowing that the world is still right there on the other side. You might hear it in the rattle of pipes, in the cough from the next room, in the clink of a bottle being set down somewhere down the hall. But you also know this. Whatever this night is, it belongs to you now, even if only in the smallest way. And if hearing nights like this erased from history bothers you, subscribe, or the silence wins again. If you thought the wedding ceremony was exhausting, just wait until you discover the sheer logistics of getting undressed in Victorian Britain. You, standing in a small bedroom lit by a single candle, are wearing the very outfit society has insisted will make you the picture of feminine beauty. It's the height of fashion. It's also a booby trap. Layers upon layers of fabric, stiffened with everything from whalebone to horsehair, conspire to keep you both upright and utterly immobile. The corset alone could probably stand up without you in it, and might even fight back if challenged. The crinoline, that wide cage of steel hoops or stiffened horsehair, is supposed to give your skirt its grand bell shape. In reality, it has been knocking into door frames, catching on furniture, and nearly taking out the occasional guest all day. You've sat through the wedding breakfast with your knees angled awkwardly to avoid upending the table, all the while wondering if anyone else realizes this contraption is less a garment and more a mobile prison. And now, the moment you're supposed to look effortlessly alluring, you are facing the reality that getting out of these clothes is an Olympic event. Hooks and eyes, laces and ties, each hidden somewhere you cannot reach without bending in ways the corset does not allow. You need at least one maid, possibly two, to undo the back. But of course you are not at home with your usual maid. Tonight there's only your new husband, whose experience with corset laces may range from absolutely none to watched his sister's maid do it once and thinks he remembers. There is a peculiar tension to this part of the evening. Undressing, in theory, is meant to be intimate. In practice, it's more like dismantling an elaborate stage set while the audience waits impatiently for the performance to begin. And heaven forbid you undo things in the wrong order. One false move, and the entire skirt could collapse onto the floor like a deflated tent, leaving you tangled in petticoats like a trapped moth. Even your nightgown, that supposedly delicate symbol of bridal purity, is heavy with meaning. White, of course, to signify innocence, though the fabric might be more practical than luxurious. Cotton lawn, perhaps, or fine linen. The lace trim and ribbon are there to soften the impression, but they still whisper the same message: modesty above all. These garments are designed to cover more than they reveal. Yes, the neckline may dip slightly lower than your day dresses, but the hem will still brush the tops of your slippers, and the sleeves will likely reach your wrists. It's not lingerie as we understand it today. It's virtue in textile form. And this is where fashion becomes more than just fashion. These clothes, the corset, the skirts, the modest nightdress, are not simply about style. They are about control. Every layer is a reminder of the social structures wrapped around your body as tightly as the whalebone. You are meant to be seen, admired, and desired, but on society's terms. Move too freely and you risk scandal. Breathe too deeply and you strain the laces. Fashion dictates not just how you look, but how you stand, sit, walk, and, yes, even how you undress. You might think this is an exaggeration, but consider this. Victorian medical advice often insisted that corsets were good for you, that they supported the body, encouraged proper posture, and prevented unseemly movements. Translation: if you can't bend, you can't run. If you can't breathe deeply, you can't raise your voice. The garment literally shapes your body to fit the social ideal, and that ideal includes obedience, delicacy, and dependence on others. So here you are, expected to be the picture of allure, while wearing what amounts to a set of decorative shackles. Your hair, painstakingly pinned and curled that morning, is starting to droop under the combined weight of time and hair oil. The candlelight flickers over the whalebone curve of your corset, over the starched cotton of your chemise, and you are thinking, though you will never say aloud, that this is less seduction and more strategic engineering. If you're upper class, a discreet servant might have been tasked with readying the room before you arrived, lighting the fire, warming the sheets with a bedpan, even setting out your night clothes in an artful display. In some houses, there might even be an undressing room adjoining the bedchamber, so you can make your entrance in carefully staged fashion. But most brides, even wealthy ones, will find the process of changing out of a wedding dress is a far cry from the romantic vision painted in novels. For working-class brides, the challenge is no less real, though the clothing may be simpler. A well-fitted corset is still standard, as are multiple layers of petticoats and skirts, and while your dress may not be sewn with Parisian silks, it will still take time and effort to remove. The room is smaller, the light dimmer, and the bed closer, but the feeling of being physically encased remains. And here's the unspoken irony. The same society that demanded this rigid elegance also expected the wedding night to proceed with a sense of natural passion. Yet it has dressed you in a way that requires a full dismantling of your outer identity before anything can happen. You are supposed to go from ornamental display to intimate partner in the space of an hour, without acknowledging that the process of getting there is awkward, tiring, and occasionally ridiculous. When at last you are free, the corset loosened, the crinoline set aside, the layers peeled away one by one, there is a strange lightness in your body. You can take a deep breath for the first time all day. Your shoulders drop. The candle gutters low. And you realize, in that quiet moment, that this is the closest you've come to feeling like yourself again since the day began. And then, of course, you remember, you are not alone in the room. Morning has arrived, though you're not entirely sure how much of the night you actually slept. The candle burned down to a nub hours ago, leaving the air faintly scented with melted wax and yesterday's perfume. Your body feels not entirely your own. You might imagine the first day of marriage would begin in peace, that the world would grant you a few hours to collect yourself before the next round of expectations. But in Victorian Britain, the morning after is not just your morning, it is a public event. If you are of the upper classes, the household knows, not because you told them, but because they are expected to know. The maids who bring up breakfast will glance, just for a moment, to see whether you emerge from the bedchamber with a flush of triumph or the drawn face of disappointment. The butler, impassive as ever, will ensure the family's silver is polished for the celebratory tea, while mentally filing away his own private conclusions. And then there are the relatives. Your mother-in-law might offer a cryptic smile over the marmalade. A cousin may make an innocent comment about how well you're looking this morning. Every word is laced with double meaning. No one will ask outright, of course. That would be unseemly, but they don't need to. The real game is in the implication. In some elite households, the gossip goes even further. In the grander country estates and certain aristocratic circles, there is an expectation, unspoken yet utterly understood, that proof of consummation will be quietly conveyed. A maid might be tasked with laundering the bed sheets, and whether or not those sheets are discreetly displayed or whispered about depends on whether they meet the day's standards. It is a performance, and the audience is vast. Family, servants, sometimes even the local community. And yes, in a handful of particularly showy noble families, that performance spilled into the press. The Victorians adored a scandal, and the more genteel the setting, the juicier the whispers. A newly married couple spotted leaving their rooms at noon might find themselves the subject of thinly veiled hints in the society pages. A late breakfast could be interpreted as passionate success. An early one? Oh dear, perhaps nerves, or worse, incompatibility. If you're middle class, the scale may be smaller, but the principle is the same. Neighbors notice. Friends of the family happen to drop by. Your own mother will want to see you, and she will study your expression like a military map, scanning for signs of victory or surrender, and you will smile, because that is what is expected. You will laugh politely at the hints, bear the teasing, accept the knowing glances. Whether you are inwardly joyful, awkward, or aching in more ways than one, none of that matters. The performance must go on. For the working classes, the scrutiny is less about romance and more about survival. In crowded lodging houses, your wedding night may have been audible to anyone within range of the thin partition walls. The morning after, when you step into the shared hallway, there is a chorus of nods, winks, and muttered remarks. It's part congratulation, part assessment. And while it may lack the silk-gloved subtlety of the drawing rooms, the effect is the same. Your private reality is community property. This is where Victorian gossip reveals its true power. It isn't just idle chatter. It's a form of social control. Gossip keeps people in line, enforces norms, and ensures that everyone understands the consequences of deviation. Fail to live up to the expectations. Be too cold, too unwilling, too obviously unhappy, and the story will spread. Maybe not in print, but in parlors, at markets, in whispered confidences between friends. You might think you could simply ignore it. But in a society where reputation is currency, gossip is a tax you cannot avoid. One unflattering rumor can tarnish a woman's social standing for years. It can close doors to invitations, strain relations with in-laws, and even affect your children's prospects. And for men, gossip can just as easily question their virility, their authority, their ability to manage a household. The cruel irony, of course, is that the truth rarely matters. You could have had the most blissful, mutual, and respectful wedding night in history, and if someone decides to suggest otherwise, perhaps because they dislike your family, or because your expression at breakfast wasn't quite radiant enough, the version they tell will be the one people believe. So you learn quickly that radiance is a social skill. You apply it like face powder. You dress for breakfast as though nothing could possibly be wrong, even if you've barely slept. You sit, you sip tea, you answer questions about the weather while pretending not to hear the sotto voce comments drifting from the far end of the table. You play your part. Because the alternative, letting them see the truth, is unthinkable. And as you take another bite of toast, you realize something unsettling. This is not a one-time ordeal. This dance between public image and private reality will repeat itself again and again. When you have your first child, when you suffer your first illness, when you hit your first real disagreement. Society is always watching, always speculating, always ready to spin your life into a story that fits its own script. Because in the Victorian world, your body, your marriage, and even your emotions are not entirely yours. They belong, at least in part, to the gaze of others, and the morning after your wedding night is just your introduction to that truth. It begins on your wedding night, or rather, it begins with the unspoken understanding that from this night forward, your body is no longer entirely yours. The first act in the Victorian marital script sets the stage for the second, childbirth. And in this second act, the supporting cast changes entirely. Out go the elderly midwives with their herbal teas and quiet authority. In come the men with degrees, stethoscopes, and a professional air that somehow makes you feel both reassured and completely powerless. You would think childbirth, the single most ancient and natural of human experiences, might remain a woman-led affair. After all, for millennia, it was attended almost exclusively by women, mothers, aunts, neighbors, the village midwife who had seen every possible complication and could tell you exactly how long to push by the sound of your breathing. But in the 19th century, that world began to close. Slowly, steadily, the men moved in. They called it progress. And to be fair, some of it was. Advances in antiseptic technique, the beginnings of germ theory, the idea that medical training might be useful when things went wrong. But along with progress came a takeover. By mid-century, male doctors had claimed the authority to decide not only how you gave birth, but whether your pain should be relieved, your position changed, or your instincts followed. The irony? They often had less practical childbirth experience than the women they replaced. A midwife might have delivered hundreds of babies before she was ever trusted with her own casebook. A young male doctor, however, might arrive fresh from university, having attended only a handful of births, most of them in hospital settings nothing like a crowded tenement or a drafty country manner, but he had letters after his name, and in the Victorian hierarchy, that was enough. And then there was the matter of pain. In an age when chloroform and ether were available, and even fashionable among certain circles for surgeries, many doctors refused to use them in childbirth. Why? Not because they didn't work, but because pain was considered divinely ordained. To relieve a woman's agony was to interfere with God's will. Childbirth pain was seen as a biblical duty, a righteous suffering handed down since Eve's unfortunate apple incident. Picture it, you after hours, perhaps days, of contractions, a male doctor standing by the bed with his arms folded, explaining that your agony is not only natural, but spiritually improving. This is not neglect, he insists, but moral guidance. You are, in effect, being told to offer up your pain like a devotional candle, except your candle is screaming and exhausted and may at any moment lose consciousness. Some women fought for anesthetics, of course. Queen Victoria herself famously used chloroform for the birth of her 8th child in 1853, declaring it soothing, quieting, and delightful beyond measure. That royal endorsement helped break the taboo, but only to a point. Many physicians, especially those with more sermon than science in their approach, continued to resist, citing everything from supposed harm to the baby to fears of overindulgence in comfort. And so, for many Victorian brides, the wedding night was the first step in a cycle of medical subjugation. Your body entered the care, or control, of professionals whose decisions reflected not only science, but the moral and cultural codes of the day. Consent was rarely part of the conversation. A doctor might examine you without asking, instruct you to lie in a certain position without explanation, or dismiss your own sensations as hysteria. Of course, the medicalization of childbirth also shifted its setting. Where births had once been a domestic, community event, attended in your own home and surrounded by familiar faces, they were increasingly moved into hospitals, environments designed and run by men with rules to match. Privacy was minimal, protocols were rigid, and your ability to influence your own care was limited to the occasional plea. And in a bitter twist, these new medical settings were not necessarily safer, at least not at first. Hospitals, especially before antiseptic practices became standard, could be breeding grounds for infection. Maternal mortality rates in some institutions were higher than in home births. But the narrative of progress was powerful. If a man in a white coat told you this was the modern way, you believed him. Or at least, you pretended to. Meanwhile, the social expectations surrounding childbirth were no less suffocating. The ideal Victorian wife was expected to endure her pregnancies with grace, deliver her children with stoicism, and resume her household duties with minimal complaint. The fact that you might have been physically broken by the process was rarely considered a reason to slow down. After all, wasn't this what you had been designed for? And if you dared to object, to resist your doctor's instructions, to ask for relief, to say that you did not want another child so soon, you risked being labeled difficult, ungrateful, even unnatural. Victorian medicine had a word for women who didn't conform to its expectations: hysterical. And once that label was applied, it could justify almost anything, from forced treatments to the rest cure, which often amounted to enforced isolation and inactivity until you learned compliance. Looking back, you can see the line that runs from your wedding night to the birthing room. It's the same thread: control disguised as care, morality wrapped in the language of science. First, They told you what your wedding night should be, how you should feel, how you should perform, what proof you should produce. Then they told you how to give birth, how much pain you should endure, how much choice you should surrender, how little your own voice should matter in decisions about your body. It is, in its way, the ultimate Victorian paradox. The era prided itself on advancement, yet when it came to women's most intimate experiences, those advancements often entrenched the very hierarchies they claimed to challenge. And as you lie there, hours after delivering your child, the doctor nodding with satisfaction at his work, you might wonder if the wedding night was simply the rehearsal for this, the moment when you learned, without being told, that your life from now on would be lived under the polite, suffocating weight of other people's authority. They don't tell you this in the etiquette manuals, but not every Victorian wife accepted her fate with a delicate sigh and a fresh pot of tea. Some women, quietly, strategically, sometimes recklessly, fought back. You can almost picture it. The parlor curtains drawn, the sound of paper tearing as you rip up the proper script. Because the truth is, marriage in this era was a legal trap, but not a perfect one. There were cracks in the walls, and if you were clever enough, brave enough, or desperate enough, you could slip through them. Some women fought in court. Imagine standing in a dark, wood-paneled courtroom, your lawyer, if you could afford one, explaining in polite legalese why you should not be required to live with a man who treats you as property. The odds are not in your favor. Divorce law in the mid-19th century was heavily weighted toward men, and your case would likely be dissected by a roomful of men in wigs who think your marital duties are sacred obligations. But occasionally, someone broke through. There are documented cases of wives who successfully petitioned for legal separation or custody of their children. Rare victories that made the papers, often with a tone of shocked disbelief. These women were labeled scandalous, dangerous, bad examples to others, but they were also proof that resistance was possible. Of course, you didn't have to fight in the open. For every headline-making case, there were dozens of quiet escapes. Underground networks existed, often operated by sympathetic friends, relatives, or reform-minded women's groups. They would help you vanish, sometimes literally, by finding you work under an assumed name, or shelter in a different town where no one asked too many questions. Picture yourself slipping away in the early hours, a small carpet bag in hand, wearing your plainest dress so as not to draw notice. A friend's cousin meets you at the station, takes you to a safe house, and whispers the rules. Work hard, keep your head down, and never, ever send a letter home that can be traced. You might never see your old life again, but that was rather the point. Wealthy women, meanwhile, had more subtle tools. The marriage law said your property became your husband's the moment you wed. But legal trusts could bend that rule. A well-advised bride might have her fortune placed in the hands of trustees before the wedding, ensuring her husband could not squander it on bad investments or other women. It was a genteel form of rebellion, done with ink and parchment instead of midnight train tickets. Sometimes, this financial armor allowed a woman to dictate the terms of her marriage entirely. She could refuse to fund her husband's whims, invest in causes he disapproved of, or simply maintain a private income that gave her the option, rare but real, to walk away. Of course, this required a family willing to protect you and lawyers willing to be discreet. Not everyone had that luxury. For most, defiance came at an enormous personal cost. Social exile was almost guaranteed. Leave your husband and you might find yourself shut out of polite society, your name whispered over teacups as a cautionary tale. Employment options were limited. Even reformers who supported women's rights sometimes hesitated to help fallen wives, fearing the moral stain would spread. Then there was the risk of retaliation. An angry husband might pursue you through the courts, using the law to drag you back or strip you of your children. Victorian fathers had near absolute legal authority over their offspring. If you left them too, unless you were willing to fight an uphill battle for custody. And even then, the courts might give them to him purely out of principle. And yet, women still did it. They walked away from the security of a home, however suffocating, into the uncertainty of independence. They risked poverty, gossip, loneliness. They endured years of rebuilding a life from scratch. It's tempting, from your vantage point now, to imagine yourself among them, the fearless ones, the clever ones, the ones who refused to be written into the footnotes. But the reality was messy. Some returned, defeated by the sheer difficulty of survival. Some stayed hidden for the rest of their lives, and some found a kind of freedom that made every risk worthwhile. What's striking is how much resistance could be disguised as obedience. A wife might appear dutiful while quietly diverting household funds to a secret account or cultivating friendships with people her husband disapproved of. She might agree to his rules in public while living by her own in private. It was a kind of slow-burn rebellion, less dramatic than a midnight escape, but no less deliberate. And perhaps that is the real lesson here, that defiance in the Victorian marriage was not always loud, but it was often constant. Every woman who negotiated a little more freedom, who withheld a little more of herself, who found a way to bend the rules without breaking them. She was part of a quiet tradition of survival. You can almost hear the whisper of it in the background of history. There is always a way out, even if it is only a way through. The etiquette books will never tell you this, of course. They'll tell you how to curtsy, how to pour tea without spilling, how to accept your husband's authority with grace. But somewhere between the lines, if you know how to read them, you can find the ghosts of women who didn't follow the rules. Women who paid the price, yes, but also claimed the prize, the right to live on their own terms. And so you imagine yourself at that crossroads, one path safe but stifling, the other dangerous but yours. The air is cold, the road uncertain, the luggage light. But for the first time since your wedding night, you feel the faint, unfamiliar pull of possibility. The fire has burned low now. Its last embers crackle softly, casting shadows that move like slow dancers across the ceiling. The room is quiet. Not the kind of silence you had on a Victorian wedding night, filled with expectation and social pressure, but the good kind, the earned kind. You're lying back in bed, centuries removed from those rooms of heavy curtains, turned keys, and whispered instructions you couldn't refuse. Your body is not cinched in whalebone. No one is about to knock at the door with a tray and a reminder of your duties. If you want to say no, you can, and that no will carry weight. That alone is worth noticing. It's easy to let your eyelids droop here, in this room that doesn't demand anything from you. Still, a thought lingers. How much has changed, and how much of it could, if we aren't careful, change back. Laws feel permanent until they aren't. Customs seem absurd until someone revives them. Progress isn't a one-way street. It's a road that always needs guarding. especially when it's been paved with other people's suffering. Somewhere outside, a carriage rattles over cobblestones. The sound is faint, as if it's been traveling a long time to reach you. You hear the distant clip-clop of hooves, the soft hiss of wheels through damp air, the muted chime of a clock marking the hour. The city settles into its night rhythms, same as it did all those years ago. But you are not trapped in its old rules. And in the half-light between waking and sleep, you can almost see the faces of those women who endured, resisted, or escaped. They do not ask for thanks, only remembrance. The knowledge that their choices, and their lack of choices, built the world you're lying in now. So breathe. Let the sound of the clock steady your heartbeat. Let the faint rumble of the carriage carry away whatever scraps of the day are still clinging to you. Tomorrow, you'll be perfectly respectable again, until you forget your gloves. If you've stayed with me this far, subscribing is the easiest way to show you've got my back. Good night.